I'm going to go through first a bit of a background on Innovation Amplified, but also the concept of innovation labs in terms of sort of a bit of a journey point. Just sort of like some key factors to take into account, and then some sharing about some stories, and then getting into how we do it in practice. So to start off, we have labs for lots of stuff. So there are labs for science. And when do we think the first science lab was actually invented? It's actually the 16th century. So we've had science labs, like alchemist labs, for a long time. So we're fascinated with the idea of putting something in a space and having intense focus with expertise around it. We also have labs for technology. So when do you think that we had the first technology lab? In the 1900s, and according to my notes, General Electric had the first research lab. So you can see we've been sort of enamoured in our human existence around science and then technology. But we also need labs for social and environmental complex issues facing humanity. When do you think we started doing labs in this area? So it does have a little bit of traceability back to the 60s with people like Peter Drucker in terms of management theory, talking about the need to connect with your broader community. We have had a long history of sociologists talking about how we work with our communities and so forth. French scholars started to get more into the idea of the social in the 70s. In the 80s, you started to see this sort of interaction and diffusion of technology. But actually, it's only really been the last 2 decades, so really since the early 2000s, that this concept of a lab for the social has really started to take a lot of global predominance. So the reason why that history point is important is when we actually think about convening and building innovation through social kind of factors or psychology, we're actually, a lot of us, coming from a scientific paradigm. We should have the experts coming together, we should have a very rigorous, repeatable process that's the same. And for some reason, you know, we feel very kind of secure in kind of that sort of way of thinking. So this whole idea of the journey of, I guess, ThinkPlace really taking leadership around social innovation across a few sectors is actually as much of a discovery and emergent process that we've been going through. And I wouldn't even say, despite having hundreds and hundreds of ways of documenting how we've gone about doing social innovation across a few different sectors in Australia particularly, we are still learning. And actually that's almost the very kind of ethos of actually a social innovation lab, is actually a learning lab. So that becomes something interesting when it comes to, well, what is it we're trying to actually make when we're talking about social innovation labs? So there's a couple of big because statements I wanted to share with you about why this trend in the last couple of decades around social innovation is really building power. This idea that where things change is weighted at the nexus between who has the most power and who has the most knowledge, is that sort of where there's control, like the control strategy. Like if I've got all the knowledge and power, then I can make change happen. That is still true, but increasingly the types of issues that we're facing, society issues, environmental issues, people with less power and less knowledge are paradoxically becoming more powerful and able to take more control and actually create change. So the whole idea of a social innovation lab is actually embracing this idea. We're not actually trying to find where the power sits. We're not necessarily trying to find where the knowledge sits. We're actually trying to create a system or ecosystem that actually tries to optimise and co-create new forms of power and new forms of knowledge. That is actually quite confronting for people who are confident in their power bases and their knowledge bases. So therefore, if we're actually working and convening the social, we have to be open to how we go about embracing and identifying those with the lowest power base, those with the least amount of knowledge, but reframing it so that we're actually co-creating those two things together. Another because, which is pretty important, those with the power, so they still exist, so governments, corporations, don't actually have the answers required to solve the actual complex issues that are facing us. So what that actually means is that even the people with the power are now asking the question, we need help. And that's actually really encouraging. So there's no point in this discussion today to present the lack of effect of those in power, but rather to say more and more with those that do have responsibility for social systems, public policies, people in large corporations that do have and see their responsibility in the communities that they serve, employ in, that actually there's issues around us that they just can't solve on their own. So increasingly this argument that we have to actually embrace the multiplicity of people and things around us is actually also within the acknowledgement of where the power sits. The other because is that actually the acknowledgement that efforts to change some of our complex problems are actually not working. So why is it that we actually still have women who need support and help if they're feeling stress or not in a healthy relationship, don't get the support they need? Why does that continue? Why in Australia do we have the Murray-Darling, an environmental and social catastrophe, despite continuous efforts, reviews and all those sorts of work? Questions can be built over and over about those sorts of big scale things that aren't changing. So everyone's actually interested in saying, how might we do these things differently? So the concept of a social innovation lab is actually about asking people to invest in the concept of collaborating, the concept of investing in ideas, and also experiments to learn where and how might we make meaningful and systemic change. That's actually quite different because most of the paradigms that we seek to invest in, I'm thinking predominantly Western, tend to be give me a problem space, invest in some options analysis, and then let me kind of get to a deterministic point and then go from there. Social innovation labs are actually saying you need to flip where you put your investment, which is investing in people with no idea what the solution is and quite possibly no idea what the actual problem is, and then actually looking to unearth ideas that are more emergent because of who you've brought together, not because you had an idea to start with, and that you're actually willing to try some small things quickly to learn, and then from that process actually start to understand what is really going to make a difference to the actual location of the problem that you're solving. And these arguments I'm sharing with you because they're important, because when you are actually either trying to convene people and run through more of a design-led emergent process, there often are people coming from worldviews they haven't yet articulated, but our doctrines in terms of management theory, where we've studied the organisations that they've either grown up in or have worked in, and particularly public policy, are recognising that their pathways coming in have to be different, but often they hit a stumbling block, and it's actually our job to help kind of frame the argument as to why they need to operate differently. So one of the challenges has been since the last few decades, as I said, around social innovation labs is that actually what does it actually make and what does it do? And that's another interesting kind of reflection, because we have an insatiable desire to think that it comes out when we do something effective, there's something we can touch, feel, point to. And this list that I have here, that actually I drew out of a paper from a number of years ago called Joined Up Innovation by an author, Jeff Mulgan from Nesta. It's quite interesting to reflect on that when we convene for social innovation reasons and into some sort of lab or coherent way of working, the sorts of things that you're creating, yes, you're looking for new ideas, concepts and paradigms, but that's one of about a dozen points that you're actually creating, which is actually pretty exciting. So you're actually changing power relationships, for example. You're actually looking at that point I said earlier, where you're actually reimagining, well, what is the knowledge we need here, reimagining who actually holds the power to make the change, and in that actually start to present the world in different ways, but actually for people to look at each other differently and say, what could we do differently together? Interestingly, a second point I want to highlight here are new skills and sometimes new professions. So my experience for the last 3 years, particularly around driving social innovation labs, I'm constantly surprised by the people who've participated in the lab process, how much they've gone back to either their own organisations or their behaviour back in the sector in other forums or other contexts has completely shifted. And what I mean by that is the shift from feeling they have to know the answer to every problem to actually treating things more like an opportunity to explore, an opportunity to understand an empathetic view of things, but also willing to actually experiment, do things in a small step way so they can learn rather than feel like they've got to make a big commitment. The other point there, just worth highlighting, it often gets missed when people are designing or incubating ideas to go commercial and make things more of a product-based view or a service, is that new laws and regulations need to change. And increasingly, the labs that I've been running, that's the voice that often sits on the outside and says, can you give us the report that says what ideas do we need to think about to go through our policy process or whatever it is, so it's sort of external to it. And increasingly, by actually having the lawmakers and the regulators involved in social innovation labs, they actually start to get an appreciation both of the possibilities, but also actually to give them much more of a different evidence base to take through their own cycles. It's still an area that I think is a point of learning and opportunity to evolve, but the idea that we're actually looking at how you activate the whole system together is actually quite critical. So this concept of social innovation labs and what they create, there's a lot of different elements. So when people say, oh, let's evaluate your social innovation lab, you need to be really quite robust in thinking about what are all the threads when you talk about evaluation. And there are a lot of then very kind of traditional views of evaluating anything. But some of these things are about when you do create them, if they are existence for a project, if they exist for a program, or they move into more of a living lab, which I think is a different concept again, you then need to actually have an appropriate way of understanding what difference has it made for its context. So I actually thought that I would just give you kind of like 4 main elements of the experience myself and a number of ThinkPlace people have been having over the last 3 years, where, and I've amplified the word systemic innovation in the innovation sector, or the energy sector, sorry, and particularly about driving renewable energy. And the reason why it was all about systemic innovation, there's a lot of other labs out there. So there are incubator labs and accelerator labs that take great ideas that need definite funding and scaling, and we've got some of our team here at ThinkPlace who work on those programs. This particular program really was about starting to architect space for all the things I said earlier, where, yep, there's power in the system, not literal power like energy with electrons, I mean power of decision making, lots of big organisations, lots of small organisations, people like you and me who are going, I want to change my energy control and actually start saving money. And it's all these factors all at play. And so what was actually missing was not more government policy or traditional kind of like road mapping thinking. It was actually saying, how do we better convene the way the system actually thinks together? So I've just wanted to share a couple of kind of anecdotes from kind of how it's played forward from people who've participated, just to kind of highlight that it's not just running workshops, you're actually inventing and introducing new spaces, new ways of convening, and actually getting people to rethink and reimagine what we're all wildly agreeing about but have no way how to get forward. So for example, one participant had said there is no space to have a higher level strategic discussion, and even when these are started, maintaining momentum and getting mutual commitment to make progress has been elusive. A-Lab has provided a forum for these targeted strategic discussions and problem solving. Another partner to the A-Lab in terms of a key, I guess you could say an association group in the energy sector, Energy Networks Australia, they made a comment that the workshops through A-Lab have led to some truly collaborative and innovative opportunities to diverse energy stakeholders to explore transformational opportunities and innovation in every aspect of how we think about energy, from renewables to storage to system design. And that's a pretty big deal when you're coming from a worldview in this space around energy, where everyone pretty much has a worldview of a roadmap, taking steps to get to some determined future, and the feeling of predictability and comfort that we can actually work things out technically to get to the result, hoping that nothing else changes around us as we make those decisions. The bit I wanted to amplify is that there's actually ways of thinking about how we innovate. And the Social Innovation Lab kind of architecture of A-Lab, which really started at the back end of 2015 and was really starting to take a bit of a hold around 2016, is that part of the magic is the world often is stuck today in all of the rational reasons, all of the statistics, all of the arguments about what is actually happening. And the energy system in this particular case is full of a huge amount of experts and a whole bunch of logical reasons to why things are the way they are, why they're not are. And then in particular, there's this really weird thing called a human that's playing around in the energy system saying, I want to do what I want to do. And for everyone who's had a paradigm of, well, we control that system, just freaking out, just going, well, they can't do what they want to do because we control it. So there was this kind of real tension point here. Now, everyone tries to solve from today's space, but part of a good social innovation lab that we've found through our process is actually how do you frame that world that either may like or not like what's going on into a perspective that says, let's just kind of somewhat forget about today and actually start to say, what is the future we ought to have? I read something kind of nice about social innovation labs, which is you can solve problems based on what do we actually need, but actually a social innovation is actually about what ought we have and what's the life we want to have. That's actually quite different. So this equaled what's the life, what's the world we want to have, which actually made all these people who, for all their roles, whether they've been in the business for 30 years or 10 minutes, kind of wildly agree, you know what, this actually is the future we wanted. So in this particular one, yes, there is a bias. It was called low carbon. Yes, there is a bias, social equity. Yes, there is a bias, we wanted to have competitive marketplaces. And yes, there is a bias, we wanted to make sure things are safe, reliable, and so forth. I didn't think that vision was too bad. I don't think that is a bad thing for the planet. So a good social innovation lab really builds an inspiring and something that everyone can sign up to vision. The really interesting thing when it comes to innovating, I'm not a fan for just this, oh, let's go grassroots, bottom up, let's just have this random kind of like post-it note kind of thinking process. If you actually want to get towards somewhere, you need to think about, well, if that is the future, the life we want to see, what do we need? What do we actually need? What will we actually see if we saw that future actually playing out? And this isn't one conversation, it's just not one little workshop, it's an ongoing dialogue. So actually spending time, first of all, about really understanding the life we want to create, and then how are we going to create that life, on what basis or what sort of hypothesis would really help us see that. This is quite revolutionary when people have predetermined views about how to get there, or they've got a strong basis of expertise and knowledge. You're actually asking them to completely forget about that, to the point that when you're thinking about the future, there might be things that don't exist today. And so in this particular scenario, when we were developing the A Lab, everyone actually had to accept the fact, whilst we didn't like the fact that these people have no idea about energy apart from they pay bills, wanted to do something about changing everything, they actually are going to be the centre of the universe in the future. So see where that's going to happen. And part of the framing that occurred was this deliberation around, well, where might we need to innovate if that's actually going to be the future we want, for all those things that I said we had a strong bias for. And those different aspects that framed innovation, so one of them was, well, if we have a future where you and me could actually generate and sell and use energy how we saw fit, including generating a hospital down the road or giving some of my electrons to my neighbour who I know is not well, if I wanted to create that sort of world, one of those things is we actually needed a different marketplace that doesn't exist today where I could trade that electricity. So that was an example of we'd have to have a whole new market system. So when you come back into today's world and say, we want a whole new market system, if people want to take a logical step-by-step process, that's where they've been. They'll just freak out going, well, we can't do that because it's all these barriers. So part of when we do innovate is that you want to provoke a sense of tension in today's terms based on the frames you've developed from the future. And those frames have evidence. So when we wrote about each of these frames, they have evidence that actually helps people understand why is that so important, what opportunity might that fulfill, what particular things today are why we don't have that. So you're actually grounding it in some facts of today, but you're actually saying this is what we actually need to do if we're going to make our difference to the future. So I just want to say the first point is about how you structure and frame and give people a sense of where are we going to play to generate ideas for the future is the first big lesson. The second one is that you are engaging people from across the ecosystem. So that's interesting because you actually need to challenge everyone's view here about who is in that ecosystem of people. So when you're designing a social innovation lab, you actually need to, as designers, I guess our role is actually to break the paradigm about who has the right to collaborate and engage. And that is something that is actually a work in progress, to be fair, because you can't turn a system that's been working in stovepipes or in formal structures into something that's highly collaborative overnight. So the patience is you need to think about what is the sort of system that we'd love to see in a room. So in our experience, when you started on day one, and we've run 15 events that have been part of this system, day one didn't look at all like in terms of the types of people, things that we'd like to see, but we always would measure ourselves against the diversity we expected to see. And it wasn't until, as one diversity measure is, you could imagine in this sector of energy, there's a lot of fantastic blokes and not too many fantastic women. However, they're coming. And it was up to probably our 13th or 14th event where we almost had 50% in the room women. So the point about your goal as a social innovation lab is to have the vision, not just from what the change you want to see, but the vision about who you're trying to actually activate into the actual social innovation lab as well. And that's important because that actually is helping break down some barriers. It's also the basis in which good ideas actually come as well. And I wanted to just point to a little bit of theory, which is important. So when I say we as the designers, so the voice of design enabling social innovation labs, we actually need to understand what is going on in terms of the kind of strength of social ties. And I think this is interesting because when you overlay this idea of people can collaborate if the social tie is quite strong and the relational intensity, like how often we come together, might be highly frequent. So it's a very different kind of space if you're going to drive some dialogue around what could we do differently. The reality is, in the convening of this particular social innovation lab, most people haven't played together. Most people really base their identity and sense of contribution on their expertise, which means they want to always look like they know what they're talking about. I mean, most people do, that's a fact. However, you're actually putting them into an environment where they often don't work together. You're asking them to stand up and work in a way that will be different. And so our job is actually to be almost like the social interaction date maker, speed date maker, in a very real way, in a very safe way, and that you're actually also trying to find ways that they want to keep meeting and coming together. Because one of the opportunities of a social innovation lab is not just from an event perspective, but from building relationships that stand the test of time. So if you can catalyse the ability for people who don't normally work together to work together, that is giving them a life skill. So some of the things that I find personally fulfilling in running a social innovation lab is actually seeing people as people grow. Having the skills to actually say, hi, my name is Bill. I'm afraid of jumping off buildings because I don't do that normally, but I want to find someone who does do that because I could learn something from you. So how do you teach people the skills of interacting with others that are not like them? Then how do you build the skills to generate the right ideas that can come from the differences between you and others? So the other important aspect of both building the social, so the responsibility of actually how to build relationships and so forth, when you convene people, you also need to spend time actually building people's innovation mindset. So this is a picture of me in probably one of the most remarkable A-Lab ones we've run in terms of events, in that we actually generated some amazing innovations at that particular event. Just the fusion of people we had at that particular one really was quite exciting. But there's a bit of a framework that I actually use, and I think part of the job when doing social innovation labs is not to rest on the same theory all the time, but to find some really good anchors that actually give people permission to behave differently. And if you can do that both through your own exhibiting skill set, but also taking people through very conscious learning modules, it becomes a really important backbone in terms of how a social innovation lab works. So an anecdote from a woman from a different lab we were running here in ACT around domestic violence. She's actually a lawyer. She said she came out of a 2-day event with us and she said, I think I've been to a management development program. Plus we've come up with some great ideas to actually how we might make a difference for women in need. So it actually is incumbent upon those who convene and run and enable social innovation labs to actually build that innovation mindset. And so even just as a quick kind of click on a particular framework I use, there's a whole lot of good theory around, I guess, innovators' behaviours and DNA, but you have to build courage to act. There are some very explicit skills, such as the ability to ask questions, and there's also just some really deep cognitive skills that people need to learn. You need to teach them. So how do they build associative skills, and how do they actually play at the same time of then deploying that play into a serious topic, such as the different frames that we are working on. This is actually a quote from that particular frame, the book that I read around this, which is on Innovators' DNA by Dreyer, Gregerson and Christensen. But one's ability to generate innovative ideas is not merely a function of the mind, but also a function of behaviours, which is really important because a lot of people think, well, I'm not creative, so I can't do this. It's actually our job to help stimulate people's ability to understand that they actually can enact behaviours that for the purposes of convening can be enough actually to generate some fantastic ideas. So part of actually what a social innovation lab is doing is constantly teaching, as I said, and enabling them to have some learning activities in a safe way. But it has been proven, and I've seen it for the last few years, you can fundamentally actually improve the creative impact. And I've used the word creative impact there quite deliberately, because creativity is actually at the genesis of what you need to be actually a great designer. So some theorists actually say you can't teach creativity. I like the De Bono school of thought, which is I think everyone can be. But it actually is incumbent upon the person that runs a social innovation lab. So all of us, when we actually stand up and we facilitate, we engage, we are not process. We are actually vehicles of creativity. So that means what comes with that is our ability to behave in ways that actually exhibit. What does it mean to be creative? What does it mean to actually behave more innovatively? And actually also to be challenging and pushing people, but bringing ideas to the table ourselves as well. This is a photo of Phil, who works for Arena, so he's a client on the A-Lab side. The design thinking aspect is important to bring in. Systems thinking and a few other methods tend to be referred to if you read about social innovation labs. The idea of the design thinking angle, which we're all quite proficient in, is that there's some really tactical and tangible ideas there in terms of how to work. And in particular for this lab, because design is about being human-centred, and this system was struggling about how to be human-centred, it's actually been quite a core value proposition how we run this particular innovation social lab. So that means that in part of the process, or every stage of the process, who does it impact, how do we engage them, has been a really important ingredient. It is always the ingredient in terms of who's your customer in that sense, but for this particular lab, it's been like at the core, because the whole system that you're trying to innovate in has actually been quite unsophisticated about how it engages its end users. So again, drawing off our strengths in terms of design is actually a really important element in terms of running social innovation labs. The process itself is something that I tried to convince a client recently who we gave them an experience of the first stage, which is ideate, which is the space to generate ideas, right? The space to say, if this was the world we wanted to see, and this is the focus of an element of how we might get, or what needs to be, not how, but what needs to be in that future. The space to just say, well, what could we possibly do, not evaluate it, is a really important first stage to actually get that convening of the possibilities, or the art of the possible. And then the next stage is to say, how might we take some of the best ideas, and the best ideas evaluated really at the time based on what the goal is, but also the participants, to actually incubate in terms of going deeper, so actually building them up for cases of investment or cases of scaling in terms of from a combination of partners who want to work together. And then in accelerate, there's a few kind of ways of thinking about this part. In the case of this social innovation lab, because it was government, the accelerate was actually how to accelerate a large scale program, not just someone's one idea. That's different to some incubators that take a great idea and scale it to market. So social innovation labs need to actually be designed in terms of its actual innovation process to meet the goal, or whoever's sponsoring it, or whoever really has the appetite to run that lab. So in this particular case, the whole idea of the innovation process is actually to generate projects that both get invested in, that we can learn from, and then where we think there might be some larger scale funding to invest in, where might we do that. But my comment that I said before I talked about the process around, you need to repeat this over and over. So one client said, oh, we just have done that, that's fine. We don't need you anymore. We've got all the ideas we need. That'll cover us for the next few years. That's not a social innovation lab. That was just an idea workshop. So she'll make it very clear, if it's an idea generation workshop, it's just a workshop. An actual lab is a vehicle that is actually, it's running, it's doing something. It's trying to run a series of events or a series of things that are going on. You're looking for traceability and so forth, and you're actually trying to see how you're helping change actually happen. So that's just a lesson around innovation. Be careful you're not just doing, it can be fine for events, but an innovation lab actually has to feel like you've got a team that actually is running it, you've got a series of events and frames that help kind of structure why you're coming together, and you have a real sense of people care about things moving forward. And then as these things move forward, more participants come in from a, I've got resources, I have capacity. And that's the other big thing. Social innovation labs aren't about one investor or one piece of government or one particular player. You actually end up bringing through this process more people as you come in, so that what you might find is actually you have a great idea here that has quite a different kind of partnering and who's been involved in actually making it happen, and then where it might go in terms of a larger scale change. And that's actually why it needs to be a system. A workshop won't give you that, because you just hope that things will happen, but they won't on their own. So in the case of the A Lab, we generated this summary around what sort of things had been done at a particular point in time. So this was at the end of 2017. And so it was saying of all the different innovation frames that we had architected about trying to get to a future or life we wanted to see, these are all the sorts of projects that had actually been got up and funded. And the different shapes were actually funded through what sort of stage. So there were a number of things that were still around. They're still at the idea stage, so they're still kind of like kicking around. Things had moved into incubating. And then also some things were coming out of Accelerate, which were large-scale funding projects where quite a significant amount of funds had actually been distributed. And the different colours actually indicate where there's multi-parties convening. So that's another distinguishing fact with the Social Innovation Lab. You're actually saying none of those partnering, none of those coloured little shapes existed before the Social Innovation Lab convened them. That's actually quite important. You're actually looking at how do you create new partnering, new opportunities to collaborate that didn't exist before. And I think that's a good measure of a Social Innovation Lab, is that ability of saying we've actually convened and brought about partnerships that are bringing about a new value to a broader system, not just to one particular player. So on that note, basically, I just wanted to say that my experience, and I think where a lot of the ones that have sustained over time around social innovation, they are a really important vehicle about how we can get to the future that we want. That's it.